The CBS television network presents Kuwait, Middle East Oil Prize. Is Howard K. Smith.
Good evening. It is the standing policy of CBS News to bring you today's news today. But tonight we're going to do something. We want to bring you tomorrow's news today. Iraq has gone over to the Arab nationalists. Soon or late, in one way or another, the world's richest single piece of real estate, the little desert sheikhdom of Kuwait, is bound to be drawn into the rushing mainstream of Middle Eastern events. Kuwait is a patch of desert floating on the most prodigious sea of oil known to man. Its reserves of that precious fuel are called almost limitless by geologists. Texas is almost a secondary source by comparison. Kuwait is wedged in between Iraq, lately turned nationalist, and Saudi Arabia, the least advanced nation in the Arab world. It is situated at the head of the Persian Gulf, that small perimeter that supplies most of the free world's industries, from Britain across Europe and South Asia to Japan, with the fuel those industries must have to operate. The dominant force in Kuwait right now is Great Britain. But Kuwait's most recent mention in the news came when a few days ago Kuwait's ruler, Sheikh Abdullah, conferred with Nasser in Damascus. The topic of the conference between the ruler of the West's most important oil sources and the Arab world's leading nationalist is not known. But since then, Kuwait has halted the issue of visas to Western reporters and has denied cable permission to reporters already there. CBS News correspondent Winston Burdett was in Kuwait before that shutdown. Here now is Burdett's report.
This is Kuwait, at the head of the Persian Gulf, 900 miles east of Suez. A few years ago, a fishing and trading village, but today the surging capital of a desert sheikhdom that has become the biggest oil producer in the Middle East. Population of the country, about 210,000. Area, about the size of New Jersey. Annual income from oil, more than $300 million. No place in this part of the world has seen such an extraordinary boom or such a turmoil of change in recent years. Along the Kuwait waterfront, you can still find the trade and traffic of the ancient Arab town. The shipbuilders are still making their famous dhows, the fast, high-pooped ships that Arab traders have been using for the past 3,000 years. The dhows still traffic up and down the Gulf Coast. They still carry their dates to Bombay and Zanzibar and bring home African timber and Indian spices and teak. They still smuggle gold from here to India, and at night from across the Gulf, they smuggle in illegal immigrant laborers from Iraq. The streets of the bazaar are still crammed with light, and you can still lose your way in the jostling markets under their tattered tin roofs, in the populous maze of shops and coffee houses in dusty alleys that twist between mud walls. But all of this will be gone 10 years from now. The town has already burst its old mud walls. The walls themselves have been knocked down by an army of bulldozers, and much of Kuwait today looks like a bombed-out city, with houses and mosques alike slashed in two by new thoroughfares. And every day, more houses and more walls cave in and crumble in the bulldozer's path to make way for new roads and new boulevards and new fleets of Cadillacs. In 10 years, the old town will have vanished completely. This is the new city. The ruler of Kuwait, His Highness Sheikh Sir Abdullah al-Salam al-Sabah, has spent millions from his oil revenues on the building of highways, hospitals, and schools. 10 years ago, no public school existed in the Sheikhdom. Today, there are 70 schools like this one. They are certainly the most lavishly equipped schools in the world, with movie halls and restaurants, living quarters for the teachers, courtyards and gymnasiums and playing fields, and huge swimming pools in blue or pink or chartreuse. Teaching techniques are progressive, and there is a wealth of visual aids for the children. Even the kids in kindergarten have their own theater and their ballet classes, learning Hawaiian dancing or European ballet, and putting on a year-end pageant for their parents. shortage of Kuwaiti teachers, so most of the teachers are either Palestinians or Egyptians who are provided directly by the Egyptian government. The Egyptians obey instructions from Cairo, and they are the guiding force in the educational system. The students eat at school. They get their food free as well as their clothes. And from this central kitchen, which the Kuwaitis say is the world's biggest, 30,000 school meals are distributed in thermal vans each day. There is also a special technical college for engineers, but there's been trouble finding enough students for it, and it is still partially empty. Kuwait's greatest architectural monument is a high school on a splendid campus by the sea. There is a vast central building, a magnificent library, a handsome mosque, a stadium, fine dormitories for the 800 students, and a seaside club with a swimming pool 150 feet long. Someday, the Kuwaitis hope to make this an international university for the Arab world. The Kuwait Oil Company, which has the sole concession for the almost limitless oil under the sands of this tiny country, is a 50-50 Anglo-American partnership, half owned by British, clean and polished wellhead, made of super-hardened steel that can withstand tremendous pressures of up to 2,000 pounds per square inch. From the wellheads, the oil flows under natural pressure to gathering centers, where oil and gas are separated in giant cylinders or separation chambers. Then it is pumped on to a huge tank farm on a ridge overlooking the sea. 34 tanks with a storage capacity of 5 million barrels. And from the farm, it descends by gravity to the sea, across the coastal plain and out along the mile-long pier, and then, still by gravity, into the holds of the waiting tankers. An average of 8 tankers load up here each day, and the oil that leaves this pier goes to France, Holland, Italy, Australia, Japan, and Texas. But the greatest portion of it goes to Britain, where it supplies more than 50% of Britain's oil needs. This pier can handle 86,000-ton super tankers, but already a couple of miles up the coast, they are building a new and greater pier that will take tankers of 100,000 tons. Indeed, the company is expanding all along the line. Recently, they more than doubled their refining capacity, with 2 new refineries to produce gasoline, diesel oil, and tanker fuel. Expansion goes on also in the field, and up north in another corner of the Kuwait Desert, they are busy prospecting and drilling a new field that will probably go into production sometime next spring. The one thing that you don't see in this whole operation is oil, but you do see plenty of signs and warnings to remind you that it's there. The port, the refineries, the gathering centers, every installation has its own firefighting equipment, and its entire personnel is trained to use it. Each installation is inside a fenced compound, guarded by company watchmen and Kuwaiti police, who relieve you of your matches and your lighters when you go in. Fire is the ever-present danger, and fire is never very far away. Day and night, the desert is ablaze with the flares from the burning of the excess gas. This gas is not being wasted. There is simply much more of it than can now be used. It supplies all the power needs of the company and of the Kuwait government, and what is left is burned. Scientists are now working on a way to make this gas commercial for export, that is, to pack it and transport it in bulk. And someday, no doubt, a way will be found. They have a special training school here for Bedouin boys, a school run by the company. None of the boys can read or write. Their first class is in arithmetic. They go on from there to become electricians and welders, fitters and auto mechanics. A boy who a few years ago was destined to spend his life tending goats in the desert is now learning how to use machine tools and how to bore a cylinder. It's a revolution in Bedou life, for traditionally the men in the Bedou camps shun manual labor. The men merely look after the camels and brew the coffee, and the women do all the rest. Now their sons from a dozen desert tribes are learning how to use an acetylene torch. And how to strip a diesel engine down to nuts and bolts and put it together again. And how to take a wrecked truck off the road and repair it and give it another 40,000 miles of life. All this before they can sign their own names. Even the life of their fathers is changing slowly. The tribes are now veering away from their traditional migration routes, and every afternoon towards sunset, in slow caravan across the desert, they come in with their herds of camels to use one of the new water wells drilled for them by the oil company. They cannot write a single letter of the Arab alphabet, but they know the wavelength of Radio Cairo, and they follow what Nasser says about Arab aspirations and the politics of the outside world. You see a far greater change in the new oil town of 15,000 persons that has sprung up here, Ahmadi, the headquarters town of the oil company. This is a very cosmopolitan place, where Muslims, Christians, Hindus, and Buddhists live, work, and worship side by side. Of the company's 8,000 employees, more than 1,000 come from India and Goa, another 1,000 from Pakistan. There are more than 2,000 Arab immigrants from half a dozen countries, and on top of this, about 900 Britishers and 73 Americans. Most of the Americans are drillers, geologists, and engineers. The neat brick and stucco houses in which they live have electricity and air conditioning, gas stove kitchens, bath and plumbing, and ample space for gardens. Only one rule is strictly enforced. The Kuwaiti employees, so as not to disturb their neighbors, are allowed to keep only 2 goats, 2 sheep, and 6 chickens. Because of that, many of the Kuwaitis have turned down the offer of modern, comfortable housing and prefer to go on living instead in their own tent encampments outside the town. Under the terms of the oil concession, exactly half of the oil profits here go into the private coffer of the ruler of Kuwait. This year, his revenues may reach a record-breaking sum of $375 million. Such wealth over the past few years has made the city of Kuwait the metropolis of the Persian Gulf. Before oil was found here, Kuwait's only natural resource was brackish water that was unfit to drink. Water came by dhow from Iraq, was sold in goatskin bags and delivered on the backs of donkeys and camels. Now the Sheikh has built the largest water distillation plant in the world, drawing salt water from the sea and producing 4 million gallons of fresh water daily. Right next to the water factory, an American firm is busy dredging a modern harbor, a $23 million job. 10 years ago, there were fewer than 10 automobiles in the entire Sheikhdom. Today, there are about 25,000. The number is growing, and the traffic jams are getting worse every day. When the cars are run down, they're just driven off the road or into the desert and abandoned. 5 years ago, movies were still forbidden and movie houses unknown. Today, $1 million movie palace looms at the edge of the city. And there are 2 theaters inside, one for American and European films, the other for the latest films from Egypt in Arabic. Many new mosques have sprung up about the city, and at night their pointing minarets are garlanded with electric lights and glitter like jewels as the worshippers arrive in limousines. And elsewhere, an entirely new market center is being built, and eventually the old congested bazaar of Kuwait will be wholly transplanted into clean, fresh, airy quarters like these. The bazaar of the goldsmiths and coppersmiths will be the first to move. With more money than it knows how to spend, Kuwait has become the world's most spectacular welfare state. Everyone, Kuwaiti citizen or foreigner, is treated free of charge in the wards and clinics and operating theaters of the Sheikhdom's modern hospitals. He is cared for by European doctors and by trained nurses from Egypt, Syria, and India. Every Kuwaiti citizen is assured a job by his government. He is assured a home in one of the new housing developments, where his rent may be as little as $4 a month, and even that goes toward eventual payment for the house. He gets a transportation allowance, and if he needs a loan to buy a car, he can get that too, with the government paying the interest. New housing has not kept pace with the demolitions, but if a man's house is condemned and demolished, he gets fantastic compensation for it, as much as $30,000 to $40,000 for a mud hut in the middle of town. And with the money, he can buy a refrigerator, an air conditioner, and a car. This method of compensation has been one of the more spectacular ways that the Sheikhdom has found to share the wealth and put cash in the pockets of the population. Technically, Kuwait is an independent Sheikhdom. Its government is the personal instrument of His Highness Sheikh Abdullah and his family. The government's income is his income. Its revenues go into his private purse, and he himself keeps the strings of it. Each government department is headed by a sheikh of the ruling family. Thus, a brother of His Highness is Minister of Health and Public Works. Another brother is Chief of the Town Police. A cousin is Minister of Education. And an uncle, Sheikh Abdullah Mubarak, is both Deputy Ruler and Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Armed Forces. Each of the ruling sheikhs lives in a sheikhly manner, with a retinue of servants and bodyguards, an armada of shining limousines, and a palace or palaces where he holds court. The tables at a sheikhly banquet are laden with mountains of rice and chicken and a score of whole sheep. You will meet at the sheikh's receptions the American and British oil executives who run the country's oil industry, the American consul, who aside from the British is the only foreign diplomat here, and a British diplomat who is known as the political agent. This Britisher is a very important person. He is, in effect, the foreign minister of the country. For nearly 60 years, by special treaty terms, Kuwait has been under the protection of the British Crown. The British political agent handles the Sheikhdom's foreign affairs, and Britain is responsible for the defense of the country. They say that the reserves of oil here are around 60 billion barrels, but in fact the reserves of Kuwait are so great that they are beyond calculation. On the oil of the Persian Gulf, the entire free world in this hemisphere, from Britain to Japan, depends for its industrial future. For how long will it all last? Certainly no end to the great boom here is in sight. There's money for everybody, and there's every prospect that Kuwait's huge oil revenues will go on getting huger. And yet, even here, there is the rustle of political discontent. You can feel it in the bazaar, where blaring radios bring the message of Arab nationalism from Cairo, where streamers and posters proclaim the slogans of the Arab cause, and where Gamal Abdel Nasser is the hero of the coffee shops. Nasser's picture is everywhere, on the rugs that you buy in the marketplace, even on lighters and rings and key rings, on handkerchiefs and coffee cups. There is a small but vocal nationalist movement that follows the Nasser line. There is a new generation that is learning to read and write and to think politically, and which looks to Egypt as the progressive force and vanguard of the Arab world. There's been an unprecedented influx of foreigners, of Arabs from other countries, including Egyptian and Palestinian technicians and experts hired to help administer this Sheikhdom. They are the carriers of ferment and change. It so happens that the oil sheikdoms along this Gulf are the last area in the Middle East where the British still hold paramount power. It happens also that Arab control of Arab oil is one of the major objectives of Arab nationalism. Finally, there is an archaic government to which the tremendous western stake in this little land is tied. A government made up of tribal sheikhs who rule autocratically, who are already quarreling among themselves about the succession, who spend their money as they will, who make their own law and their own rough justice. And so even here in rich Kuwait, there is a rising cry for reform, for some representative government, for press freedom, and for rule by law. Even here, there is the prospect sooner or later of radical political change. The great challenge to the West in this vital spot is how to go to meet that change before it is too late, before the riptide of Arab nationalism crashes on this distant shore of the Persian Gulf.
Since his trip to Kuwait, Winston Burdett has returned on a brief visit to New York, and he's here in the studio with us now to help answer some of the questions that are in everyone's mind. Winston, would you dare a prediction about Kuwait's future?
Well, Howard, in the 6 weeks since I visited Kuwait, the tide of nationalism that I spoke of has swept right up to its borders, and I can't see how Kuwait can resist for very long. This is a completely artificial and archaic state. An accident of history has made Kuwait a British protectorate. An accident of geology made it the site of the biggest known concentration of oil reserves in the world. Geography placed it on the borders of Iraq, and the Iraqis regard Kuwait as their natural outlet on the Persian Gulf. Even before the Iraqi Revolution, the Iraqi government invited the ruler of Kuwait to Baghdad and urged him to merge his little state with the now defunct Iraqi-Jordanian Union. Ironically, only 3 weeks ago, the British also were publicly urging him to do this, largely in order to protect Kuwait from the subversive appeal and enormous power of attraction of Nasser's Arab Union. Obviously, Kuwait has no future as an Arab nation because it is not a nation. Its ruling family cannot be the focus of political loyalty, not in an era of dynamic nationalism. Its newly educated class can find no place in its medieval political structure. You cannot teach people to read and write and think and still expect them to accept the fact that they can be arrested and flogged in public because they have the impudence to overtake and pass on the road the limousine of one of the ruling sheikhs. The hundreds who are pouring out of the schools of Kuwait will soon be thousands. And in a country where the press and the right of assembly are practically abolished, this new literate generation will demand a daily newspaper to read. That will be a revolutionary demand, because of course they will want to write in the newspaper and express their political opinions. The ideas they express will be Nasserist ideas. For Nasser, beyond the borders of Egypt, through his missionaries, his teachers, his technicians, and his propaganda, has succeeded in identifying himself with modernism, progress, and social reform. Even in the desert of the Arabian Peninsula, Nasser is the great name and great myth, the symbol of Arab revolt, of independent nationalism, and of the utilization of Arab resources by the Arabs themselves. It's a very explosive mixture of ideas.
Well, Winston, what's the outlook for the oil in Kuwait?
Well, Howard, as in Kuwait, so in the entire Arab world today, because of oil and because of nationalism, you get a sense now of great and unpredictable changes ahead. On the one hand, there are the have countries, the oil countries, like Iraq and Saudi Arabia. On the other, there are the have-nots, the countries without oil, like Jordan, or with very little oil, like Egypt. At one extreme, you have the pleasure-loving Cadillac and Palace set, and at the other extreme, you have nearly 1 million destitute Palestinian refugees and the impoverished peasants of the Nile Valley. In Arab eyes, this does not make sense, and neither does Kuwait make sense, a tiny city-state staggering under the impact of sudden wealth, with more money than it can spend on even the most expensive social improvements. The ruler of Kuwait spends about 1/3 of his money on these improvements, and roughly another 1/3 has gone to current expenses and the upkeep of the shapely establishment. And the last 1/3 is either banked or invested in gilt-edged securities in London. None of it is invested in the needy Arab lands around Kuwait. So the Arabs say that Kuwait's revenues, or anyway a good portion of them, should be redistributed for the benefit of other Arab countries, the poorhouse of Jordan, or the even vaster poorhouse of Egypt. This is the irresistible argument of pan-Arab nationalism. Sooner or later, I think, the march of events around Kuwait will be irresistible also. British troops, of course, could land there. They have a treaty right to do so. But it's hard to see how even they could reverse the tide for very long. A merger or federation of Kuwait with a larger Arab Union would mean first a redistribution of oil revenues among the Arab states. Later, inevitably, it would mean increasing Arab pressure for a greater share of the revenues. And finally, it would mean increasing nationalist demands for an Arab share in the ownership and management of oil operations from the time that the crude oil is produced in the field to its final delivery and sale as gasoline at a gas station in Tokyo or London. Nasser's immediate objective is a share of the oil revenues, and if the Arabian Peninsula is the prize of his Arab Union, then Kuwait is the greatest Middle East oil prize of all.